guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go! Good morning, my friends and fellow elite achievers. Welcome to Modern Leadership, the podcast where each week we sit down with authors, entrepreneurs, and leaders to explore their journey, diving into the ups, their downs, and ultimately the lessons they learned along the way. Our goal, of course, is to show that everything is figure-outable. Today's guest expert is Carey Jenkins. Carey had an unconventional path to her current position as CEO of Substantial, a Seattle-based digital product studio that has worked with companies like Amazon, Mercedes-Benz, and the Wall Street Journal. From a theater major and journalism degree to quitting her dream job at Jane Magazine and working with a career coach to ready herself for a CEO position at Substantial that she prepared for before it was even available. Carey knows how to turn her dreams into reality. In fact, she joined the client services team at Substantial in 2012 and became their CEO 6 short years later. Carey, it's so wonderful to have you on the podcast. How are you today?
I'm great. It's good to be here.
We have such a deep dive to get into with your career trajectory and your path and the things that you learned along the way. But before we do that, we know a little bit about you from a business perspective. Give us a little flavor of who you are on a personal level.
Well, I am from the South. I'm from Louisiana, sort of a smallish town in Louisiana. I was actually born in Nashville, but I've spent my entire young life in the South and most of that in Louisiana. And that has definitely shaped who I am in a lot of ways. I am a person who really believes strongly in relationships. I am certainly an energetic and outgoing person by Seattle standards. I still feel like an outsider sometimes in Seattle. And I left the South for college and really have stayed out and about for most of my career. But the South is still in me. And I find myself I've been in a lot of different environments. I worked in New York for several years. I've been in Seattle now for 12 years. And I love the comparison of the West Coast to the East Coast. I prefer the West Coast. I can securely say that now. But there's something really warm and special about the South. So I like to feel like I bring a little bit of that to Seattle. I have a daughter. She's 5. I have a partner. We've been together for a decade now. He is certainly a major part of me being able to step into the CEO role. So I can definitely attest to that being a much easier transition when you have somebody you can really count on to pick up the slack. There's lots of slack in other parts of my life these days. And I love to read. I'm a huge reader. I love to learn. I think that's probably why I love to read so much. So I'm sort of a lifelong learner.
Well, and I think the listeners of the podcast are definitely relating right now to what you're talking about, being learners and readers. And I think podcast listeners in general love education. They love to constantly challenge themselves to grow and learn more. I want to take you back to a time in your life where you were actually learning quite a bit, and that is college. And it sounds to me, at least through your bio, Carey, that you started out thinking, I'm going to be a journalist. I want to write. I see myself in the magazine and the newspaper world. So tell me about that time period, what you were thinking, and kind of where you saw your career going, hopefully in your dreams at that point.
Absolutely. So I got a Bachelor of Fine Arts in New York and wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with that. So I spent about a year in between college and grad school, working in a restaurant, waitressing and bartending, and sort of figuring out what am I going to do now? And there wasn't an obvious answer to that question. And I wrote a lot in college and really enjoyed writing. And like I said, I've always been an avid reader. And so it occurred to me that journalism might be really interesting. I was an avid consumer of magazines growing up, and that was always the medium I intended to go into. So I was never really envisioning myself as a beat journalist and newspaper journalist. It was always a longer form feature writing for magazines. So I happened, coincidentally, to have a beloved uncle who was a mathematics professor at the University of Montana. The University of Montana has a really strong journalism program, but their graduate program is directly sort of built and focused on people who have degrees in other industries, right? So it encourages you to have come from a different background. And so that was really appealing to me. It's the only grad school I applied to. I thought sort of that'll tell me if I should do this or not. And I got in.
It'll be a sign, right?
Right,
If I
exactly.
get in, that's where I'm supposed to go.
Yeah. Oh, the things you do when you're 23. Like, I'll make this life decision by whether or not I get into this one program. Yeah, it was kind of like that. And I did get in, and I moved up to Missoula, Montana, which is an incredibly charming town. For those of you who are thinking of visiting Montana, don't miss Missoula. It's adorable and beautiful and has a lovely smaller university, the University of Montana, sitting in the middle of it. And that's where I went to journalism school. And it was a fantastic experience. I learned a tremendous amount about writing and journalism school, particularly in that age, because this was pre-internet really being, the next big thing. The internet was around, but not at all the way, this was mid to late 90s. So we really learned old school sort of trade journalism, and it was really beneficial in a lot of ways. But I definitely thought I was going to be a writer. I was going to go write for a magazine. And as I was finishing up the program, I put a bunch of magazines out in front of me and was like, which one would be cool to work at? And I loved women's magazines for sure, but I wasn't super fashiony. So I wasn't really like looking to go to Vogue or something like that. But there was a magazine at the time called Jane Magazine. It's since shuttered, but it was created by Jane Pratt, who is pretty famous for being the editor-in-chief of a teen magazine called Sassy, which a lot of women my age were huge fans of, including myself, because it was sort of the anti-17 at the time. It was just a very different tone of voice to teen girls. And she created a magazine for older women, sort of in their 20s and 30s.
And this is the Jane.
This is Jane.
Yeah.
And so I called up the publisher of Jane Magazine and called up their HR department and basically said, I want a job. And the person who answered the phone happened to be from Louisiana. Pure coincidence.
Instant connection.
Instant connection. And, actually, I think I sent him my resume, and the reason he called me back was because I was from Louisiana, now that I think about it. But either way, it was total coincidence. So get him on the phone. He's like, well, I'm going to support, someone from Louisiana. Come out here and I can give you a paid job that we call our floating intern. And so it was a paid job, but you basically were not tethered to any magazine. You were sent to whatever magazine needed help in their whole publishing house. And this wasn't like Condé Nast or Hearst. So there wasn't a huge portfolio of magazines, but it was W Magazine, which is their big glossy fashion magazine at the time that has since been sold to a different publishing house. But at the time, there's W, there was Women's Wear Daily, which is a fashion trade magazine. So there's a lot of serious journalists at this publishing house. And there was Jane and several other titles. But the two biggest titles there, the three biggest, were W, Women's Wear Daily, and Jane. They didn't have a job at Jane yet. So he said, come do this. And when there's a job at Jane, I'll slot you, you'll be first pick.
And where was this headquartered? Was this heading back to New York?
Yeah, this was back to New York City. So this was in Herald Square, so right across from the Empire State Building. Fairchild was, like I said, a small publishing house, but it was owned by ABC at the time, which was owned by Disney. So it was still going to work. I got orientation with Disney, basically. So I moved back to New York. I had not finished my project, my graduate school project yet, but I thought, I'll finish it in New York. Of course, that didn't happen. So if I can give advice to people, don't leave before your project's done, because if you think you're going to finish it while you're working a full-time job, you're not going to.
Right.
But I went and did this sort of floating intern position, and it was a fantastic experience. I got to work in PR departments and marketing departments and on photo shoots. I was stationed in the W fashion closet for quite a few weeks to months, which was very sort of Devil's Wear Prada kind of place to be. And I was milling around the Women's Wear Daily staff, which, like I said, were very serious journalists. And one of the last things I did in that position was assist the editor-in-chief of W Magazine as his executive assistant. His executive assistant was going on vacation for a few weeks, and so they asked me to sub in. It was very high pressure. He was a very eccentric editor-in-chief.
His way or the highway?
His way or the highway. It's some very odd ways of working. I handled it very well, and based on that, they offered me the job to assist Jane Pratt, the editor-in-chief at Jane, and her managing editor. So those are the two top people at most magazines.
So I want to pull back on this just a little bit and say, okay, a lot of coincidences, what some people would call coincidences, other people would call opportunity meeting, some of the training and experience that you had. But here you are, you find yourself with the magazine you chose, one that you really liked looking at. And now they're asking you to basically be the right-hand person or the person who keeps all the trains running on time for the head person there. And this has got to be, you're probably pretty young. This has got to be a very great position for your ego, but also a very scary position moving into. How'd you feel at that point?
Well, I was young. I was 26 at the time. I think the few weeks that I spent with the very eccentric editor-in-chief of W, which was an very high-profile magazine, prepared me. I was certainly scared when I was assigned to him. I didn't know what to expect. So for sure, I took that opportunity very seriously. And even the idea of moving back to New York for this sort of floating intern position was very risky. It paid nothing. It paid absolutely nothing. It almost would have been better if it had been an unpaid, because then I wouldn't have had the joke of a paycheck. Do you know what I mean?
The insult, the salt in the wound of seeing, and New York's not a cheap place to live.
No.
So how are you hanging on at this time?
It was rough. And that very much leads to why I ended up not staying. But, I was charging groceries and walking to work instead of spending $1.25 on the subway, which is what it cost at that time, and all sorts of things. I bought peanut butter and jelly literally every single day for 2 years. And I had no money and was, living sort of the poor life that people do when they're living in New York City. But I had this job and I was learning so much. And when I got asked to go over to Jane, I did get a little bit of a raise, but not much to make a difference. But I was really excited. And the two women I was working for were incredibly dynamic, very different women. The managing editor was incredibly down to earth, salt of the earth, tough woman from New Jersey. She'd run many magazines and she knew how to get things done. Bar none, she knew how to get things done. And Jane was, much more glamorous, sort of visionary person who was now running her namesake publication after a very successful run at the previous magazine. Jane was the youngest editor-in-chief for a long time in sort of the history of magazines. She was the youngest editor-in-chief. And so this was her second magazine and her namesake. And so it was very serious for her. She was very visionary. So these two very different women. I was, I'd spend 3 days with the managing editor, 2 days with Jane. She had another assistant that was with her the rest of the time. And it was intense. It was scary.
So what kept you going during this time? I mean, we're talking about, not a lot of pay, a lot of pressure. You didn't quite know probably at 26 the direction that you wanted to head, what your ultimate destination or outcome would be. What kept you motivated? What kept you, eating peanut butter and walking to work?
Well, the first year I really thought this was the destination. I mean, I thought I wanted to be a magazine writer. So this was the closest thing to that I had experienced to date. And so I was very motivated just because it felt like, I was living the dream. And magazines can feel really glamorous, right? There are celebrities walking in and out. I was fielding phone calls with very famous people all the time. And so there was a glamorous feeling to it. Even at W, there was definitely things were given to me out of the fashion closet. Like, here, nobody knows even what this is or who it belongs to. Take it. And I would go home with this like lovely little gorgeous cashmere something that had no label in it. I have no idea who made it, but it was glamorous. And so that was the first year, I think that kept me going.
Sure.
It was everything I wanted it to be. I just wasn't writing very much. And so into the second year, I started to worry that being an assistant was a trap. And I think there's lots of lessons here because now I can look back at it with fresh eyes. But my concern was that they were hiring editorial assistants and I wasn't being considered for that because I was too valuable as these two ladies' assistant. But the editorial assistants were getting to write more than I was.
This is important. Back up really quick and talk about this because I think this happens a lot of times. You were so valuable in the position that you were that you felt as though you were being overlooked or counted out on the positions that you wanted. If we're talking to the podcast audience here and they're going through something like this where they feel like, and by the way, Carey, a lot of our listeners here are in middle management and they're working their way up this corporate ladder or they're going to start their own business. And so I think they can really relate to this position that you're in. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. And I'll tell you that I was in that position again right before I became CEO. So it's actually it's a theme of lots of people's careers. So yeah, I was very valuable as an assistant. People who can handle high level people like that, particularly two different ones with very different needs, are hard to come by. It's hard for people. It's intense. That is an intense job. These are intense personalities. They're very demanding. And people who can handle that, that's actually really valuable. And we call those executive assistants. And there's still a bit of a, I think, feeling that that's not as valuable as another kind of job, particularly an entry-level job. And I can't express enough how valuable it is, how much I learned from that. But I, too, was sort of falling into the trap of like, I'm not getting to write as much. And so I would have conversations like, could I move over to be an editorial assistant? And, my managing editor was very honest. She's like, I'm not letting you go for anything. Absolutely not. Like, if you want to write some stuff, I'll find ways for you to write as my assistant, but I'm not losing you. I've been looking for years to find somebody I can work with, and you're it. So, she was lovely about supporting my career, but I was only a year in. So I think she gave me sound advice, patience, basically, but you're really impatient when you're 26, 27. Yeah. So I did get
40 or 50
or 40. Yeah.
We're human, right?
Yeah. So I did get some writing opportunities. I think it was good that I asked because I got some writing opportunities, but I stayed in the EA role. And now I'm so glad I did, but I lasted about another year. Frankly, I was being paid so little. And people need to understand this about the magazine industry and journalism in general. This is a highly underpaid industry. There's probably only one industry more underpaid than journalists, and it's teachers. And it is a crime that those two industries are the most underpaid. But you get paid nothing and you're living in New York City. And it's a very strange dichotomy. So the second year that really started to catch up to me. I was charging groceries on my credit card. I was really feeling sort of trapped. And I made the decision about a year in that I was going to leave New York. And it wasn't just about New York. There was a lot about the magazine world that also, when you see the guts of it, when you sort of see the sausage getting made, I don't know, you start to think differently about the sausage. So here I was thinking I had my dream job. By the second year, I'm like, wow, this isn't what I thought it would be. I've learned so much. I've gotten so many opportunities to learn in areas I never expected. I was managing the interns at that point. So it was my first management experience. I was coordinating the editorial calendar for the website, which was a very limited production, right, in the late 90s. This was like, a few pages of content, but that was a lot of experience in web, which was very unusual at that time. Most people had no experience in the guts of a website, let alone a content website. So I made the decision to leave New York. I left my beloved managing editor who I adored. She took me to a fabulous lunch and she gave me lots of advice. But one of the best things she told me is, I sort of bemoaned. She's like, why didn't you tell me you were having such a hard time living? And I was like, well, I don't know. I thought everybody was. And she's like, no, everyone else's parents are paying their rent.
But what could she have done? Was she basically saying to you, had you come to me, I could have given you a raise? Had you been more, I don't know, authentic, that we would have probably been able to support you differently?
She did offer me a raise. She tried to keep me. And it was a huge bump from where I was, but it wasn't enough to catch up on
to change your mind once you had your mind made up.
No, New York is so expensive to live. And, I was looking at places that were an hour commute away from Manhattan, to try to find a place to live. So it was a real moment. And I've talked about this with people, particularly podcasts out of New York, where it's like everyone who's lived in New York who doesn't stay has this moment where you have to swallow your ego and realize that city's not for you. And it hurts because we have just idolized New York as a society, as the place where you can make it there, or you can break it, right? Like we've told ourselves. And so if you're one of those people who realizes, oh God, this city is not for me, you have to suck up your ego and pack your bags and move out.
And it's not just ego either, right? You were talking about some of the perks that you had on the job, which, from a financial perspective are not that big of a deal, but from an emotional perspective, they were. You were talking to celebrities. You were able to take, some of these outfits home that, didn't have labels on them. You were getting an opportunity to lead the interns. You were giving opportunities to be one of the first people on the web. These are all little things that all add to not just the ego, but this fantasy desire or fantasy belief that you're in the right place. And it's hard to overcome each of those little things.
Yeah. They sent me to Hawaii the last couple months I was there because, no one else could go. It was a free trip. And they were like, well, we'll send Carey. She'll write an article, about it. There was a lot of interesting perks. There wasn't lunches, obviously, because I was eating peanut butter and jelly, but there was other kinds of perks. But when I really realized that the city wasn't for me, like all of that paled in comparison. I just knew like I'm still searching here. I have not found my thing. And the swallowing your ego is not just about New York. It's about grad school. It's about, I got my dream job and now I don't want it. It's about a lot of stuff. But I left the city. I regrouped again.
Did you know what you were going to do as you left the
Oh,
city?
no.
Did you go home and kind of recalibrate, or what happened?
No. I went home. I sort of gave myself a couple of months. That's about as much savings as I had, which really wasn't savings. It's probably more credit cards. But I gave myself a couple of months to sort of figure it out. And what I started to realize is that web experience could really be useful. And so I pretty quickly got offered jobs to utilize the web experience. And the one I ended up taking was at an advertising agency because they were just starting to realize, oh God, we got to do this web thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew how to do it. And so I got jobs that way. So that sort of started things. And then within a couple of years, I was working purely at a sort of a digital web shop. And that kind of became the path.
Was this down in Louisiana, or were you up in Seattle at this point?
This was in Louisiana.
Yeah.
So I was in New Orleans for several years before Hurricane Katrina. So this was sort of early 2000s prior to Hurricane Katrina. So I did that for, a couple years, sort of ran a web shop. And that was my first big management leadership experience because I was running all the clients and I was running the teams. And so sort of jumped kind of full force into kind of digital product world and then decided to go out on my own. I had a partner at the time who was a creative director and could sort of build rudimentary kind of websites. And we also knew friends of ours that were developers. And so we were like, what if we just became, a web shop basically that advertising agencies could use. That was primarily our client base. We did work with direct with clients, but mostly we were a partner to advertising agencies to build digital, products for them. And so I did that. I went out on my own. That was about 4 years, and Hurricane Katrina happened sort of in the middle of that. And I was in New Orleans, obviously, and the city was decimated.
Yeah.
I got out
business
fine.
dried up.
Yeah. Well, business was actually booming, frankly, but there was no internet in the city. The infrastructure of the city was destroyed.
Interesting.
So it was going to be 6 months with no internet. And you can't run a business without internet.
Not the internet-based business for sure.
Right. So I relocated up to Asheville, North Carolina, another very charming mountain town. I tend to collect little mountain towns for odd and end years of my life, and sort of hung out there for a couple of years and still ran my business. And then I got recruited to Seattle. So at that point, I had management and leadership experience. Now I was doing sort of project management, product management for my own company. I came out to Seattle and started doing product management and project management out here. And that was, like I said, around 12 years ago. And when I came out here, I sort of immediately got put at large corporations. So Microsoft, Amazon, Expedia, kind of larger, T-Mobile, a lot of T-Mobile, and did that as a consultant. And then went to a digital agency out here that was a big partner with Microsoft and T-Mobile. That's a sort of big business model out in Seattle. We have a lot of very large corporations out here, and there's a lot of businesses that specialize in being a partner to those large corporations. And so I did quite a bit of that and really got into more product management. And then also got some leadership experience and worked for several amazing women at the company I was at before I came to Substantial, and really kind of got into West Coast technology. And that was a huge culture shift. I mean, it's just a different world really in New York and in New Orleans than what we've got going on the West Coast as far as technology goes. So that was sort of my entry point there.
Yeah. So let me ask you, Carey, as we kind of round this out here, this story that took you from Louisiana to Montana to New York, back to Louisiana to North Carolina to Seattle, like what's a big takeaway that our listeners can take from this experience that you had? Like if you could boil it down and say, this journey meant a lot to me, and not all of you listening are going to be on this same journey with me, but this is what I'd love for you to take away from this.
Well, the journey for me was about my own personal development and growth more than it was about a career path. And that might not work for everybody. I'm not suggesting it would, but for me, I'd had a few moments in my life where I thought, well, this is what I want to be. And then I got I got that and was like, that's not what I want to be. And that'll shake you a little bit about trying to plan a career path, right? I had done that a couple of times, and both times had sort of come up with a feeling of like, this isn't quite right.
Yeah, and I've done it 4 times myself, and I can agree with you. I think we all fall into this tendency of saying, okay, I'm going to do, especially if we're hard chargers, especially if we're red personalities or type A personalities where we like to control, where we like to know, A is going to lead to B is going to lead to C. I think we can fall into this trap of, okay, these are the dots that I'm going to connect all the way to success. And I love the part of your story that says you just jumped in and did it. You tried it. You found what worked. You found what didn't work. You shifted. You pivoted. What we would call the adaptable leader. You adapted to your environment and the things that you were going through. And there you end up as CEO of Substantial. And so tell us a little bit about being CEO. And the real big question I want to ask you is, can a CEO have a normal life?
Depends on how you define normal.
It depends. That sounds like a lawyer answer. You're talking to a lawyer here. It depends.
Yeah, it depends. I mean, what does normal mean? I don't, do I work normal hours? I do, frankly. Substantial as a company prides itself on working normal hours. We do that for all of our employees. And as I took on CEO, I wanted to live that value as well. Do I work more than 40? Yes, I do. Do I work 60? No, I don't. So if people are, I know there's CEOs, particularly in the startup world, but certainly in large corporations that are probably working 80-hour weeks. I'm not doing that. I am working a fairly normal workload. And, I think as more women become CEOs, you're going to find that to be a lot more the norm, because I'm a mother and I have a child. And well, those are the same thing. I'm a mother of a child. But, I have to be there for her. And I am not going to give that up. So for me, that wasn't an option. I will be a CEO that has a life outside of work, a life that's really, really important. But I didn't have to change that from the ground up at Substantial or from the top down. It was already an inherent part of our culture. So yes, I have a normal life. It's insane during the work week because I try to fit as much as I can during the work week, but it is relatively sane in the evenings and the weekends.
Well, if we can take anything away from that, it's that there are opportunities out there, that not everything is cookie cutter, and there are positions that we can find that have flexibility. There are positions that we can find that match our passion, match our excitement, match our skill sets. And we've just got to be on the lookout for those things. And Carey, you're young. This may not be your last rodeo. It may be. I'm not suggesting anything. But, as you look forward, there's going to be different changes, whether it's changes of employment or just changes of direction of the firm that you're running now. And these are the things that your skill set, your experience, your background has prepared you for. And that's one of the things that we try to focus on this podcast. And that is, everything is figure outable. We can seek solutions to any challenge that we have. And no, it's not easy. No, you're not going home after 20, 25 hours. You're not spending the afternoon on the couch or at the golf club. What you're doing is working hard, but you're working intentional. And I think that's my big takeaway from this episode. And as much as I'd love to jump into so many more things, we'll probably have to have you come back on the show and talk about other aspects of being a leader. And one of the things you talk about, CEO superpowers, and we talk about leadership superpowers here, but alas, we need to change gears just for a minute and talk about learning from leaders. Does that sound like a plan?
Sure.
All right. So our first question now then is the book currently on your Kindle or bedside table. What are you reading these days?
I just finished 9 Lies About Work. Look it up. It just came out probably a month or 2 ago. Probably it's been a couple months now. It's very interesting. An excerpt of it was published in the Harvard Business Review. It's very data-driven, and it's really trying to bust a few myths, I think, that have become sort of universal truths that they believe are not universal truths in the way businesses are run and what you think is important to your employees. It's fascinating. It's probably controversial in a few areas, but it was a great book.
The 9 Lies About Work. And I'm sure there's more than 9, but this is a good starting point for us, right?
Yeah.
All right. Our second question, your leadership, or as you talk about, CEO superpower.
So I think it's probably in the realm of confidence, but not in the normal way that people think of confidence. So, I'm not a fearless person. Every moment, every opportunity I've had in my career, and very much including the step into CEO, has been scary to me, incredibly scary. And so I'm not a person who says be fearless, because I'm not fearless. I'm really scared. But I do want to have courage, and I do want to be brave. So I think that's a superpower of mine. I will jump in and I will give something a try. And if I don't know at all what I'm doing, I will try to learn. I will look it up. I will ask questions. I'm not afraid to look dumb, because I know I'm not dumb. And anyone who works with me for any amount of time knows I'm not dumb. So if I have questions, I ask them. If I need to learn something, I learn it. And when it's time to step up, I step up. And I'm usually one of the first people who does.
Yeah, and I love this. I absolutely agree. Confidence is not the absence of fear. It's courage to act in the face of fear. It's to take action. And I think that's one of the things that leadership is missing today. And that is the step forward. Even if you don't know where it's going to lead, it's to take action. So I love that. The next one is your motivational quote, philosophy, or mantra, something that you live by.
Well, I had one before, but I just got a new one this week, because when I heard it, I was like, that's my new mantra. So
Nice.
Here it is. The thing keeping you from the work is the work.
Interesting. So break that down for us. The work is what's keeping us.
The thing keeping you from the work is the work. So why this resonates with me is that I sit in meetings. Sometimes I have 10 meetings in a day, right? Like just every half hour, I'm going to another meeting, and context shifting. Then I get to my desk for a hot second, and I've got some emails to answer. Then if I have another minute, I've got a ton of Slack. And this is true for my executives. It's true for a lot of particularly the senior employees around here. And what I hear a lot, and the narrative I tell myself a lot, is all these little things are keeping me from doing my work. All these meetings, all these emails, all these Slack messages, all this time with people. And what I loved about that quote is that it reminds you that that's the job. That is the work. That thing you think is keeping you from deeper thinking, which it's not that I don't believe in deeper thinking. I absolutely do. But that thing, which is usually a person, it's usually a person who has a need. That is your job. That's certainly my job. And that to me is a good mantra to remind myself of that.
I think it's a great mantra, absolutely fascinating, and I love the way that you broke it down for us, because I couldn't agree more. I think you're absolutely right. All right, our final question then is the book that you most often gift or refer to friends, family, and colleagues.
This one is one that was really a profound moment for me probably 5 years ago. It's a book called Cal Newport. He's very
Deep Work?
No, it's before that. It's so good. So good they can't ignore you. And So Good You Can't Ignore You is actually a quote from Steve Martin. He explains it in the book, but that's the name of the book. And it is all about this idea, this narrative that we've been told that we, follow our passions and make that our job. And it really resonated with me because, I picked a couple career paths that I thought were my passion, and neither one of them turned out to be the job I wanted. And then I found myself in a career path with a job that I never would have picked if someone had said, pick your job. And I fell in love with it because I just tried really, really hard and worked really, really hard and got really, really good at it. And that's the theme of that book. And I promise you, he's written a lot of books. They're all kind of really interesting. He's well known. But that one, for people who have a really varied, unconventional career path, or people who are struggling and don't know what's wrong with their career, it's stalled, or they don't know why they're not fulfilled, I really recommend you read that book.
Well, I wrote it down, and I'm getting it myself because I've read Deep Work and, of course, Digital Minimalism, but Cal Newport is awesome. But this sounds like a fascinating read, so I've got it written down. Carey, you have been a wonderful guest. It's so great to have you on the show. Before we let you go, any last bit of advice for the audience? And then, of course, how can we connect with you, find out more about what you're doing?
Well, my advice for the listeners is this. Leadership looks like a lot of different things. And there's, certainly a title that can mean leadership, and there's a role that can mean leadership. But there's a lot of leadership that's neither of those things. It's little moments. The definition of a leader is somebody with followers. So look for those moments. If your aspiration is to be a leader, if you have leadership qualities, if you want to develop that in you, don't wait until you have the title or the role. It's there in whatever job you have now. I assure you there's leadership opportunities if you look for them. And the way to reach me, I am sort of on a social hiatus, but I am on LinkedIn, and you can reach me there, Carey Jenkins on LinkedIn. My company, Substantial, is still on social, and they're on Instagram, and you can follow both our clients, our people, and our products on Instagram. So Substantial is where you find me.
Wonderful. And we'll link all of that up on the show notes. Carey, again, thank you for coming on the podcast for this episode. You truly are a leader, and you have been a great guest today. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure. It's great to be here.
All right, my friends. Well, right there at the very end of the episode, there was some thought, this title of the book, Cal Newport's book, So Good They Can't Ignore You, that really jumped to me as something that I want to magnify in my life, something that I'd like to put the focus on, and that is, how can I become so good at what I do that people can't help but notice? How can I do this podcast to such a level that all the big names and all the big listeners and everybody is paying attention? How can I be so good that people can't ignore me? And I think as leaders, isn't this what we need to strive for? Getting so good at what we do that people seek us out, that people look to us as examples. As people follow us, they have the confidence that we're moving in the right direction. I love this topic and sure appreciate Carey coming on the podcast today and talking to us about her story, which was unconventional. It wasn't the A to B to C. There was some jumping around. There was some mistakes. And all of us go through that as leaders in our own personal development and journey. Of course, everything that we talked about in this episode can be found at jakeacarlson.com/ML135, episode 135. And until next week, I want to wish you the very best of days, an even better life. And of course, remember, everything is figure-outable. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.